Alrighty, and away we go. Today we're going to look at the presence of metacriticism and affect theory in contemporary art and pop culture. You might be asking yourself, what the fuck are those things in the first place? It sounds kind of whack, right? It seems like someone just put together some eccentrically sounding academic words to confuse their colleagues and feed their apophenia. I mean, there's little chance indeed that you will see words like metacritique, affect theory, post-structuralism, or institutional critique in any regular conversation unless you run into one of those art kids that can't stop ranting about it every 20 minutes. If that happens, run away. So, metacriticism is defined by Oxford Dictionary as criticism of criticism. That is, the examination of principles, methods, and terms of criticism either in general, as in critical theory, or in the study of particular critics or critical debates. The term usually implies a consideration of the principles underlying critical interpretation and judgment. Basically, it's a comprehensive analysis of critical thought, criticism of criticism. Before we go anywhere else though, I should address the question of why the hell am I here? Why am I watching this? Why should I keep watching? Give me like a reason to stay. Are you arguing something? What's going on? Alright, try this one. Metacriticism, as a way to expand perspective and awareness that may be of use or of detriment as one so decides. Alright, let's try another one. Metacriticism, along with affect theory, is tempting an increased lack of acknowledgement of net progress made throughout history by fixating on the eradication of the negatives. I'll get into affect theory more in a bit, but take this for now. People trying to maximize the positives and minimize the negatives in their life by any means they deem fit. Alright, let's try one more. Metacriticism, seen in a tendency to critique something that critiques itself over and over again, instinctively, impulsively, with little chance of stopping, getting lost in that cyclical sauce, as I like to call it. Right, I will provide some context while that simmers. So when we're talking about criticism itself, that's been present in art since like John Richardson in the 18th century. It wasn't until the 1960s and 70s when the art world experienced a huge influx of criticism in its movements. We see it in post-structuralism, one of the many fuck yous to modernism. We see it again in postmodernism, the leader of the fuck yous to modernism. Institutional critique, I mean, come on, do I even have to explain that one? My point is, when the 60s and 70s hit, that accelerated the hell out of critique's growing presence in the art world. Institutions, establishments, traditional conventions, movements of old, all bagged on and eclipsed by the art of the day. As time went on, a standard took over that does not allow for the separation of artist from the art, a fixation on the negatives, as it were. Alright, let's look at affect theory. The American Psychological Association defines affect theory as the idea that feelings and emotions are the primary motives for human behavior, with people desiring to maximize their positive feelings and minimize their negative ones. In 1962, a psychologist named Sylvan Tompkins identified 9 primary affects, which were eventually shuffled around and tweaked into 8 primary affects, being excitement and joy, the 2 positives, distress, fear, shame, disgust, and anger being the 5 negatives, and interest, the neutral affect. He forwarded the idea that by encouraging people to express their feelings, more wholesome relationships could be made. Isn't that nice? Bringing affect theory into the context of contemporary art and pop culture takes us to the late scholar and cultural theorist Berlant, who argued that we have become addicted to having our heartstrings pulled instead of focusing on what pulling them could achieve. Media platforms and news companies shaped the game on emotion and not just narrative and argument. Not that they knew that affect theory was a thing or whatever, they just knew what worked and did what made the money. The affect strings that seemed to be strummed the most, in my estimation, would not be the few positives of the 8. And I get it, you know? If you look at the past 2 years, it's more than a couple cans of worms. But at a certain point, what are we doing if we're just disgusting ourselves shamefully by fearing the possibility of angering one party or distressing another? How is that? Getting back on track, let's check out some of the manifestations of metacriticism in popular culture. I see it most often in shows I've come across, and one way it's done is by starting with a deep-seated issue between 2 or more characters. The show then critically lays out character patterns via memories and events that have never seen the light of screen. This critique upon critique is done until overload occurs, which I think is a literary tool to get out of that cyclical sauce, as it were. Affect theory is of course at play here, showing that it is very possible to win using its 2 positives, which takes us to the biggest point to note. Comedy is an essential element of these manifestations and in anything else that I talk about for the rest of this video. Comedy allows for the recognition of the pros and cons of all sides. Comedy allows for self-criticism. Comedy makes it easier to avoid awkward confrontations. Comedy disarms the viewer or audience. I don't doubt there are older shows that have done this, but one of my favorites is in Community, Season 2, Episode 21, The Paradigms of Human Memory. The title makes it like really obvious. In this episode, the group of main characters find out that 2 of the members have been screwing each other in secret, and they kind of flip their shit. They really don't like that that's happening. This causes a sleuth of memory paradigms that go on, feeding resentment and shame and all the rest of them until a character named Abed, basically Metaman, triggers a particular memory paradigm that produces overload, illustrated by a character named Troy going into a seizure. Boom, metacritic. Metacritique. I saw it again in multiple episodes of Rick and Morty, but my favorite episode that does it is Season 3, Episode 8, Morty's Mind Blowers. In the episode, the character Morty discovers that his grandfather Rick has been choosing what he gets to remember. Naturally, he flips his shit on not being allowed control over his own mind, binging memory after memory after memory, erasing each other's memory along the way, then binging further and further until overload occurs, manifesting itself in the form of a suicide pact taken between the two after the whole ordeal. Boom. Metacritique. Fun fact, the two shows share a writer named Dan Harmon. That's like definitely not a coincidence. Alrighty, metacriticism in contemporary art. Hennessy Youngman, a persona created by the artist Jason Moosen, gives a talk at the Museum for Contemporary Art Chicago called How to Catch a Millennial. He posts it onto YouTube as part of his Art Thoughts project. Moosen explained in an interview with Art Gallery of Ontario that he created Hennessy Youngman to critically analyze the critical discourse of art. There's our first layer of critique. At the beginning of the talk, Youngman implies that he is a millennial. Now, Moosen has a character that critically analyzes his own generation and its language, and through that, how the generation critiques. There is our second layer of critique. Now, to me, the speaker shifts between Hennessy Youngman and Jason Moosen in the messages that he gives the audience. Between the lines of hilarious institutional critique and commentary on millennials and other things, he says that it is unwise to resist the changes of the future, lest one wishes to fade with the older generation. He warns that corporations and institutions have only invested money into their causes and to be wary of that. He also notes that institutions have begun to acknowledge the power of the young and communicate with them on their own terms, bringing me to what I think is the main message of the talk, that the young has power to build institutions of their own and create your own systems and communities. I got the impression that he wants to push for the latter because it ties back to embracing the future and it brings the artist closer to their community. Building your own system and communities may also allow your minds to not have to dwell so much on that reputation that the institutions are currently dealing with. It's a way to not get fixated on the negatives, you know? That might not have been exactly what he meant, but I think it's a worthy interpretation. And we see this communication on the younger generation's terms in stuff like TikTok. I mean, you get people that just mess around on TikTok and become TikTok famous suddenly get recruited to do Chipotle ad on that same platform. Bringing it back on How to Catch a Millennial, Youngman is critiquing systems of critique in this talk, like institutional critique, by talking about the results of it. And I do mean that he critiques it. He might also do some other things, but he's also offering critiques of it. This is seen in the drawback that he reveals to the effects of institutional critique. The drawback being that traditional mediums like oil paint and canvas, they remind one of the dead white dudes in their institutions. That won't cut it in contemporary art. They must embrace the future. That can be a good or a bad thing, depending on where you stand. If you are a self-proclaimed old soul who confines oneself to oil paint and doesn't vibe with the whole Adobe Illustrator Procreation Acrobat, you might be SOL. If you are into stuff like that, TikTok, spray painting, drugs, coding, you might have better chances. I kind of ride a thin line and it makes things interesting. Anyway, community, Rick and Morty, Moosen's Pharaoh Hennessy. What do they all have in common? Well, first, they all have comedy, and that's an essential element. They would not have gotten as far as they did without comedy to ease the landing. Second, they all give their audience more awareness and perspective on the subject and any parties involved, patterns of character, or similar. Third, they are all targeted toward a cross between young and mature audiences. Despite all that, Moosen's Hennessy Youngman had a more direct message, which I liked. But now I've set you loose. If you were able to follow this, then I encourage you to search for affect theory and metacritique present in the shows or books you like or news stories you read. If you got lost in the cyclical sauce, never fear. I'm sure you're not missing much anyway. Try triggering overload without having a seizure. That might work. If you want to know my thoughts, I don't know. I think there's too much criticism in the world. Hell, this video is case in point. It's definitely a lot of things, and critique is definitely one of those things. I mean, come on. If I have to say critique one more time, I think I'm gonna lose it. I'd rather just leave it all to the critics. Really, at this point, I'm just keeping my head down and focusing on the mission, and that is just doing what I like and not stopping doing that. Yeah, that's about it. Let me know what you guys think. If you guys disagree, agree, horrified, petrified, I don't know, go out, do something, live on, watch a sunset.